Imagine this: the Cold War between the US and China grows hotter. Local incidents lead to skirmishes, and skirmishes lead to a massive loss of life. Tactical nukes are used, but it all spirals out of control. A nuclear game of chicken does not go as planned, as neither side blinks, and massive stockpiles of intercontinental ballistic missiles are suddenly given the clearance to fire. How would the US fare in such an exchange with China? Who has more weapons, missiles, and missile defenses? And who has more targets? All will be revealed. Chinese nuclear arsenal may be a bit of a mystery, but one can still roleplay it in Conflict of Nations, sponsoring this video. Conflict of Nations is a free-to-play real-time online strategy. You pick a real country and lead it through war. Your goal is world domination. The game is set in early 21st century and features modern-day weapons, including nuclear-tipped missiles. Be one of the 64 players duking it out for domination, be it by playing on a mobile device or on a PC. And Binka viewers are getting a gift. By clicking the link below, new players will get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Choose your country and fight your way to victory. In this video, both sides are on their toes. Tensions are extremely high. There is no time to add more warheads to missiles. Both countries do have a triad: intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and combat planes carrying nuclear warheads. The US arsenal is pretty big. Nominally, it has thousands of warheads, but it is limited by the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So the number of actual delivery platforms would be key. The US has vast ICBM silo fields in the central part of the country. Those missiles are huge, stored in silos beneath the ground level, ready to fire. There are 400 Minuteman III missiles ready to fire, plus 50 more in long-term storage, unavailable in this scenario. Another big piece of US nuclear firepower is the Ohio-class submarine, with its Trident II missiles. Of the 14 submarines capable of launching SLBMs, roughly 2 will always be unavailable due to maintenance. Those won't even have missiles on them. 3 or so might be patrolling, submerged. A few more might be surged out of their ports, if there is enough time. The rest would not likely be manned in time to react in an attack with little preparation. In the real world, the side which attacks first should be able to prepare more submarines. Ultimately, 4 Ohio submarines will be modeled as firing their nuclear loads right away. More might fire if they manage to sail out in time. Most US missile warheads have a yield of between 90 and 450 kilotons. The total number of Trident II missiles initially fired would be 96. The number of warheads per missile might vary, but the average that Christensen and Korda suggest is roughly 4 per missile. US Ohio submarines on deployment would be free to roam the oceans. They would have the entire nation of China in range. But if the US doesn't have much time to react, the East Coast-based Ohios would have issues reaching the entirety of China. They would first have to move closer to the North Pole. US bombers capable of nuclear delivery number 66 airframes, but there would be far fewer ready to deploy on short notice. If defending, a dozen at best would take to the air before enemy nuclear strikes pummel their air bases. If the attack is premeditated, then perhaps a few dozen might be in air. Even then, a long journey to the target would be first required. B-2s are configured to use nuclear bombs only. The old non-stealthy B-52s would be using standoff cruise missiles. Those too might get intercepted while en route. Ultimately, only a fraction of the deployable nuclear bombs for the bomber force would get to be used. There are some further tactical nuclear bombs to be used by various fighter jets available, but those are outside the scope of this video. If we assume the US attacks first, it could launch a little over 540 missiles on very short notice, and send a dozen bombers on a long intercontinental mission. How would the Chinese defend against those? Lacking more detailed info, this video will assume China has achieved launch and warning capability. Launch as retaliation will be touched upon later. The US launching salvos from their silos would be very hard to hide. The location of those silos is well known, and such salvos can be observed from dozens of miles away. Submarine launches would be much harder to spot, unless it is done near a port, which, if that side is attacking first, would not be. But the best way to track a mass attack would be with space-based early warning satellites. China has not disclosed if it has any such satellites, but China did launch 3 unknown satellites to geosynchronous orbits, which are allegedly tied to their early warning system. All the early warning satellites operate through thermal detection. Hot plumes of a missile flying up can be picked up from tens of thousands of miles away. Geostationary satellite can observe the whole of North America at once, or a huge chunk of the Pacific Ocean. When the early reports of missiles flying are received, tracking is then usually augmented by ground-based radars. For that to happen, missiles themselves need to breach the radar horizon, so the exact location of those radars is crucial. China has a smaller network of such radars, with a few radars looking towards the direction the US salvos would come from. Given the not-so-forward position of Chinese radars, the overall warning time for warheads striking precise locations would be several minutes. A more general warning for the entirety of China that a possible mass attack is underway could be had 10 to 30 minutes in advance. Chinese anti-ICBM defenses are by most accounts not numerous, if existent at all, since only several test launches have been noted. For comparison, the US performed 24 anti-ICBM tests in the last 20 years. The Chinese nuclear arsenal has been a point of contention for some time. We will analyze the matter in a greater detail in a future video. But for now, here is the final tally of what China likely has in 2021. Based on our own analysis and the source shown, Chinese DF-5s are older, huge missiles. DF-41s are their newest and most capable weapon, but one that's not produced in big numbers yet. The DF-31 is a smaller road-mobile weapon, but of somewhat limited range and with a small payload. The JL-2 missile is submarine-launched, of limited reach. China likely has 50 such missiles in inventory, but only some would be ready to launch in time. Crucially, Chinese submarines would not likely be able to survive going past the US tactical forces around the first island chain. Thus, they could launch their missiles only near China, greatly reducing their reach. So, a grand total of up to 152 missiles might be heading towards the US, with just about 300 warheads in total. But 36 of those warheads would be range challenged, reaching only Alaska, Hawaii, and maybe the area around Seattle. Even the 300 warhead figure might be an overestimation. The DF-5, for example, has a liquid rocket fuel design. 50 years ago, that meant such missiles needed to be fueled before flight, which could take an hour, during which the missile silo itself could be destroyed. Later, such ICBMs were stored ready for launch for several months at a time. If China doesn't do that, it's likely those DF-5s would not be able to launch in time before US missiles pummel the DF-5 silos. Chinese bomber fleet would not really be a factor. Their H-6 bombers are of poor range, but more importantly, the US tactical forces around the first island chain would likely prevent them from going far into the Pacific Ocean anyway. And whatever weapon those bombers could launch from the first island chain would not be able to reach even Hawaii, let alone any other US state. As mentioned though, China intercepting US warheads would be even more unlikely. Very few to no warheads intercepted is a likely estimate. US anti-missile defenses basically have just 2 systems capable of intercepting Chinese missiles. GMD system has huge interceptor missiles housed in California and Alaska, but it has only 44 of them available. Their testing results point to roughly 50% intercept chance. But even that may not prove true in an environment with multiple targets and decoys at once. The system is designed to deal with ICBM warheads. The US even has a huge floating radar in addition to several fixed-site ones, of which the most important ones would be one Aleutian Island and Alaskan locations, as their forward position would give a lot of early warning. The SM-3 Block 2A missile could in theory intercept ICBMs as well, but it is just entering production, meaning there's maybe a few ships that would have a few missiles in their inventory. The earlier smaller SM-3 missile variants are not likely to do much against ICBMs. The US would be facing several times fewer nuclear hits. Important to note, some 200 additional warheads might come over half a day after the main event, when the bomber-launched nukes reach their targets. Those, of course, could be somewhat interceptable if there are sufficient Chinese tactical forces left operational. And 2 more days after that, a salvo from another East Coast-based US Ohio submarine might come as well, as it gets to its launch position. This video will not go into the details of nuclear blast effects, its deadliness or casualty modeling in urban areas. For that, we suggest you watch our Russia vs US nuclear war video. But we will give an abbreviated estimate. The bottom line is, cities would be just part of the overall target set. Most studies seem to establish that using nukes on small cities is not efficient. Of course, in the case of the US and China, those percentages might be different. Not having as many warheads, China would have to choose whether to rack part of the US military and economy but leave most of the population alive, or to go for population centers but leave most of the other targets untouched. The US, on the other hand, would likely spend a few hundred nukes on Chinese military targets and a few hundred more on large economic targets such as power plants, ports, railway depots, industry centers, and so on, leaving perhaps a little over 500 warheads for Chinese cities. When targeting just cities, one would quickly get diminished results. Targeting a city with a population of just 100,000 may not be as damaging as targeting a crucial industry cluster. When it comes to large cities, one would need a dozen or more warheads to neutralize most of their population. Shanghai is huge. To achieve near total destruction, 24 warheads might have to be used. Chinese cities are a bit different from the US ones. The average US city is fairly spread out, with lower population density. Even the New York City population density does not match the density of districts in many Chinese cities, like Shanghai for example, which is however spread over a much larger area overall. But outside of New York, most of the big US cities are 3 to 4 times less dense. Also, China simply has so many large and dense cities compared to the US. In urban areas, especially given at least several minutes if not half an hour of warning, most people would be quite sheltered. Casualties would be reduced compared to situations with unsheltered population. Most of the warheads used are even smaller than the 450 kiloton warhead from the shown study, the average value being 300 kilotons, which would result in a smaller destruction radius. The US does have some 450 kiloton warheads on some of their Trident missiles, and China uses 4+ megaton warheads on their DF-5A missiles, but there are just 10 of those. Neither side would be short of targets, but not for the same reasons. China would fire 300 warheads. 270 warheads would get through. Out of those, 200 warheads would be used on the 150 biggest US cities, resulting in 30 to 45 million people perishing nearly instantly. Using the rest of the warheads on US cities would mean that cities of under 150,000 residents would be targeted. It's thus plausible some military and industrial locations would be targeted instead. Those 70 remaining warheads would too likely cause some additional civilian deaths, likely over 5 million more. If 500 US warheads would target Chinese cities, destruction would be several times graver. Given that population density does fall off with city size, casualties per warheads would eventually diminish. 400 warheads would lead to maybe 145+ million dead. Another 100 warheads would be used on another 100 cities of close to 1 million souls. Chinese cities are simply bigger and less spread out per population. Overall deaths after 500 warheads might even reach 200 million. That would still leave 400 US warheads going after various military, commercial and industrial targets that aren't close to cities. But given that there is hardly an unpopulated area in China where there is any industry, that might still lead to well over 40 million more dead. The final tally might thus be up to 50 million dead in the US and up to 260 million in China, and that's just for the first day or so. Those would be deaths due to direct injuries. Further deaths due to radiation sickness, modeled after the Hiroshima example, would mean another 20% more people might die within months. There would be indirect casualties too. Local lack of food, water and shelter, lack of medical attention, diseases spreading and local infighting would likely lead to millions more dead. Tens of millions of injured would have little means of getting medical attention. For every death, another 1 or 2 people might suffer non-lethal but serious injuries. China would definitely fare worse in such a nuclear exchange. On an absolute scale, shortly after the war, it would lose 250 million people more than the US. On a relative scale, China would lose 21% and the US would lose 15% of their pre-war population. The pre-war and post-war population percentages of the US population to Chinese population would not budge that much though. Long-term wise, over the next decade, increased cancer rates might kill a few million more in the US and a few tens of million in China. But there are some huge caveats here. In this scenario, China managed to detonate 270 warheads. The actual figure may be lower if China isn't deploying its warheads on most of its strategic missiles. Indeed, if US does a preemptive attack and if China doesn't have any warheads readily deployed on its land missiles, then China might be launching a counterattack with just 1 or 2 submarines worth of missiles and maybe several road mobile brigades worth of missiles, as likely not all brigades would survive the initial US strike, totaling no more than 50-ish missiles altogether, with some 100-ish warheads. Such a salvo would lead to even smaller US casualties. Furthermore, even if 270 warheads do get fired, only 70 Chinese warheads were simulated as going after military and industry targets, compared to 400 US warheads. So Chinese industry and infrastructure would suffer 6 times as much destruction. Or if military targets are examined, the US could destroy 400 Chinese air bases and naval bases, virtually obliterating the entire Chinese Air Force and most of the Navy. With 70 warheads, China could hope to destroy 70 US air bases and naval bases, but those would constitute barely half of the major US air and naval installations. And that's not saving any warheads for targeting US nuclear missile silos. Those would absolutely be targeted, so further nuke attacks do not happen later on. To reiterate, there would also be 290 additional US warheads coming in after the first attack wave, via those bombers in flight and an additional submarine en route. Those could further demolish Chinese industry and infrastructure. Also, if the war doesn't happen in mere months, and if the US decides to get out of the START treaty, then it could add 2,000 more warheads, which are ready and stockpiled as the arm race gears up. China has no such option, as its base inventory is still low. It would have to make more warheads first. But would the US really use all its deployed nukes on China? Probably not, because such a nuclear exchange would be a global event like no other. Every country would suffer immensely. Geopolitical world order would get turned upside down, and to try to mitigate that, the US would most likely be saving up a lot of deployed and ready-to-fire nukes, instead of using them all in China, because Russia could otherwise seriously threaten the US without any real threat to itself. Back in the Cold War, it was alleged that the Soviet Union had a plan to nuke various countries around the world, not just its direct opponents in a nuclear war, so no country would be much better off than itself. Even so, China would still be faced with possibly 500 or more nukes, instead of 1,200, and overall casualties in China would even in that scenario be some 3 times greater than those in the US. On one hand, China would lose more than the US in virtually any scenario, and by most metrics. But globally speaking, both countries would be shadows of their former selves. The world economy would plummet. The world would face mass hunger, disease, and unrest. No good would ultimately come of any of it. Before we go, a few more words on conflict of nations. The game is real-time, but it's not about reflexes. Rather, you plan and build your forces over days, set attack routes and try to time them so the enemy is pinned down. Perhaps even arrange an alliance with a neighbor to assist you. Some games might take you weeks to complete. You have to research units and technologies and pick your strategies. There's a ton of units to uncover and unleash on your enemies. PvP environment can be demanding. I do advise taking advantage of diplomacy and choosing your allies carefully until you get strong enough to take over the world. As mentioned, new users clicking on the link below will get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. So, log in or download the app and test your commander skills. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.